Hello, welcome to the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
Thanksgiving was always a performance in our house. An overly crisp tablecloth draped across a scratched-up oak table, place cards written in cursive even though we all knew where we'd sit, and food prepared in an anxious frenzy only to be picked at and judged in silence. I pulled up at 3:30 on the dot, parking just far enough from the house so no one could look out the window and comment on how I drove a fancy car now. The air smelled like burnt marshmallow and tension. I knew better than to expect warmth. It had been 3 years since I'd been back for Thanksgiving, and the only reason I came this year was because I had something to say. Something that couldn't be texted, emailed, or mailed in a polite little holiday card. The door opened before I knocked. My mother, Janice, wore a thick red apron with the word "blessed" embroidered across her chest like a threat. She smiled that tight-lipped smile she reserved for church people and me. "You look well," she said, which was code for, "You look older, maybe tired, possibly bitter, but I won't say that out loud because it's the holidays and God is watching." I nodded and stepped inside, the warmth of the house clashing with the cold calculation behind everyone's eyes. Doug was already loud before I even took off my coat. He always talked like he had an audience, like there was a camera crew just out of frame filming Doug, the misunderstood genius. He was leaning back in Dad's old recliner like it was a throne, beer balanced on the arm, one socked foot on the coffee table that still had a dent in it from when he threw a controller during a video game tantrum at age 27. "Elena's here," he announced, like I was some rare bird that finally landed. "Hey, look at you. City girl, all grown up and still single. Or is it divorced now?" The room chuckled. Well, Janice forced a laugh, and our cousin Kelly gave a soft little snort. My father, Ron, said nothing. Just reached for his drink. I didn't bother responding. Not yet. Let them settle into their little performance first. Dinner was called early, just after 4, so Ron could be in his recliner again by 5. We all sat in the usual places, Doug to my dad's right like a goddamn heir, Janice across from him, me on the end like a guest who might be asked to leave early. The table was crowded, turkey, stuffing, green beans drowned in butter, mashed potatoes with lumps that no one would dare mention out loud. A chaotic spread made with obligation instead of love. Doug raised his wine glass, a cheap red blend that stained your teeth if you smiled too wide. "To family," he started, and my stomach turned because I knew that tone. To blood being thicker than water, even if some of us have been away so long we forget how that works. Eyes shifted toward me, subtle but coordinated. And to Elena, who still lives alone, guess that explains a lot. He grinned, like he'd just nailed the punchline on a late-night show. The laughter came in small waves. Kelly actually covered her mouth like she didn't want to laugh but couldn't help it. My mother picked at her cranberry sauce like it had betrayed her. My dad cleared his throat, but didn't say a word. I waited. Just a beat. Then I reached for my glass, took a slow sip, and said calmly, "And yet I'm the only one at this table who pays for everything themselves." That was it. Just one line. And the silence after hit like a damn bomb. Ron's fork clinked against his plate. Doug blinked like he hadn't expected a response, let alone that one. Janice's jaw twitched the way it did when she was calculating how much damage a comment could cause in front of extended family. Kelly suddenly found her napkin very interesting. You ever seen someone slap you with facts so cleanly you couldn't even argue? That was what I gave them. No drama. No shouting. Just math. Because here's the thing they never talk about at family dinners, the emotional tab. The quiet toll it takes to show up year after year, play nice, let the jabs land without hitting back. I used to do that. For a long time, actually. I kept my mouth shut because Janice told me that being right doesn't mean you're being kind. But then I hit 35, bought my second property, and realized kindness without boundaries is just self-betrayal. Doug opened his mouth, probably to make another joke, but I cut him off with a smile. I mean, let's just be honest here. You're still living in Dad's rental house, right? With no job. Again. I tilted my head. So yeah, I live alone. But I pay my own mortgage, my own bills, and no one has to float me through life like a half-baked souffle that keeps falling. Janice made a small choking sound. Maybe it was the wine, or maybe it was the fact that someone finally pointed out the obvious. Either way, no one laughed this time. Doug leaned back, looking to Ron like he was waiting for a referee to call a foul. But Ron didn't move, just kept cutting into his turkey like nothing had happened. "Why are you even here, Elena?" Doug asked, voice quieter now. Not curious, not kind, just confused. "You don't even like being with us." I smiled. Not a warm smile, not even a fake one. Just a quiet, sharp little thing. "That's a good question," I said, lifting my glass again. "But let's just say I'm not here for the food." There it was, the shift. The unspoken knowledge that something was coming. Something no one else at that table was ready for. Because this year, I didn't come home to keep the peace. I came to end the damn war. You ever notice how memories have this weird way of softening themselves the longer you stare back at them, like bruises that fade until you almost forget how hard the hit was? Sometimes I think my family's whole dynamic depends on that, on time making things blurry enough that no one can be sure what really happened, just what feels easier to accept. But the problem with having a sharp memory, like I do, is you remember the parts everyone else would rather forget. The exact words. The exact tone. The way silence filled the room after certain names were mentioned. The smell of panic and cheap coffee when you were working 2 jobs and still couldn't breathe. I was 28 when Doug moved in with me for what he claimed was 3 weeks. That's what he told the family later, with a smirk, like I was exaggerating. But no, it was 4 months. 121 days, if we're being exact. Not that anyone but me was counting. He came in with a duffel bag, a laptop with a cracked screen, and a sob story about needing time to figure stuff out. I gave him a key. I gave him space. I gave him patience I could not afford. And in return, I got dirty dishes, late-night video game rants, and a living room that smelled like weed and Axe body spray for a season that felt like a sentence. Back then, I was making $30,000 a year working full-time at a nonprofit during the day and bartending nights on weekends. Somehow, I saved up $15,000 in 6 months. Or was it 5 months? Wait, 6 times 5 is 30. Yeah, 6 months. I think. Doesn't matter now. What matters is, I stretched every damn dollar like it was elastic. No one helped me. Not the family, not friends, not some generous boyfriend waiting in the wings. It was just me, a spreadsheet, and stress. Around that time, Mom started calling more often. Not a check-in, really, but to complain. "Your father's knees are getting worse. The roof still leaks when it rains. Your brother's trying, he really is." Always spoken like I was supposed to be a safety net, not a daughter. She'd say things like, "You've always been so ambitious, Elena, almost too ambitious for a girl," as if that was a compliment, as if the worst thing a woman could do was succeed without a man helping her up the ladder. Dad wasn't much better. He'd call once every month or 2, always cheerful, always surface level. "Just wanted to hear your voice, sweetheart." Then somewhere between small talk and silence, he'd find a way to slip in something about Doug. "You know your brother's struggling a bit. Can't seem to catch a break." I wanted to say, maybe if he caught a job instead, but I didn't. I bit my tongue so often I swear I developed a scar on it. The thing is, I didn't mind helping. Not at first. When Mom called to say they were behind on the mortgage, I didn't hesitate. I just wrote the check. I didn't do it for applause. I didn't even do it for recognition. I did it because I thought that's what good people did. That's what family was supposed to mean. You step up when the others can't. But then last year, I overheard Doug at a cookout telling someone that Dad left him the house because he was always the one who stayed close to home. That's when I realized he actually believed it. Believed he earned it. I didn't say anything that day. I just walked inside, poured myself something strong, and sat with the kind of fury that doesn't yell, doesn't cry, just burns slow. Then a few months ago, I came back home briefly to help Mom clean out the attic. She was having one of her sentimental moods and wanted to go through old things. I figured it would be dusty boxes, yearbooks, maybe a few forgotten Christmas decorations. But what I found tucked behind a cracked photo frame changed everything. It was a manila envelope, sealed badly, the edges worn from years of being shoved in and out of corners. Inside, a stack of papers. Deed documents, financial statements, and a legal file that had clearly been revised multiple times. I saw my name. Then I saw it crossed out. Not erased, not deleted, crossed out with an actual pen, like someone had gotten angry halfway through a sentence and made a decision they didn't want to forget. At first, I thought maybe it was an old draft. Maybe just a placeholder. But no, there were signatures. Dates. And right beneath the scratched outline where my name had once been, a new beneficiary had been added in shaky handwriting, Douglas Raymond Granger. I sat there for a long time after that, holding that file like it might disappear if I blinked. I didn't tell Mom what I found. She was too busy talking about some ceramic angel she couldn't part with. I just nodded along, my fingers still gripping that paper like it might start screaming. You know that moment when your gut finally catches up with your heart, and every little suspicion you ever had suddenly makes perfect, horrifying sense? That was the attic. That was the envelope. That was the moment I realized my silence all those years hadn't protected me, it had erased me. So no, I didn't come back this Thanksgiving for stuffing and nostalgia. I came back to ask why someone had to cross my name out in order to make room for him. By the time the turkey had been carved and most of the side dishes picked over, you could feel it, that slow drag of tension seeping into every word, every look, like thick humidity before a storm. The kind of atmosphere where people start talking too loud, laughing a little too sharply, and saying things they've been holding in for years under the polite excuse of just joking. You learn to hear the venom behind the velvet, especially when you've been on the receiving end of it for most of your life. Doug had been riding the wave of his earlier jab, thinking he'd won some kind of moral victory by pointing out my still single status, like he'd stumbled upon a universal truth. But really, it just gave him permission to open the floodgates on every bitter, buried resentment he'd been nursing for the past decade. That's the thing about people like him. They see someone who worked hard, who carved a life out of rock with bare hands, and instead of being impressed, they start looking for the cracks. So, Elena, Doug said, his voice already full of that casual smugness that made my teeth ache, do you ever think maybe you're just too successful? Like, maybe that's the problem? Can't imagine it's easy dating someone when you've got all that money and opinions. He laughed, like it was just some innocent observation, but the table knew better. Even my mother looked up from her wine, eyebrows twitching like she wanted to say something but couldn't decide which side she was on. You can't be that successful and not broken, Doug added, reaching for another roll with the confidence of a man who thinks cruelty is a form of comedy. I didn't flinch. I didn't roll my eyes. I didn't give him the satisfaction of reacting like I used to when I was younger, back when I still hoped for some form of decency from him. Instead, I smiled, slowly, the kind of smile that made Janice reach for her wine glass again and Ron adjust his seat like he suddenly needed to be anywhere else. That's an interesting theory, I said, my tone light, almost amused. Because I was just thinking about success myself. You know what's wild? I leaned forward a bit, elbows resting near the cranberry sauce. How people who talk the most about hard work never actually do any. Doug smirked like he was about to come back with something sharp, but I didn't give him the chance. I let my hand slip into my jacket pocket draped over the back of my chair and pulled out my phone, swiping with practiced ease until I reached the screen I'd queued up earlier. Just in case. I was looking over some property titles the other day, I said casually, letting my thumb hover over the screen. Specifically the one for the cabin upstate. The one Dad always took us to in the summers. You know the one I mean, right? The one you said he left to you in the well. Doug nodded slowly, still cocky. Yeah. What about it? I tilted my phone so everyone could see. It's mine. The silence was immediate and profound. Not shocked silence. Not confused silence. The kind that drops a floor out from under people because they suddenly realize they've been standing on a lie for years. Doug laughed, a short, forced sound. What are you talking about? I'm talking about a revised deed, I said, tapping the QR code on the screen. Title legally transferred. Signed and notarized. You can scan it right now if you want. Or I can send it to your email, though I'm not sure you've paid for internet in a while. Ron's face went pale, a kind of gray-white I hadn't seen on him since the day of his minor stroke 3 years ago. His fork clattered against his plate as his hand slowly dropped to his lap. Janice nearly spilled her wine trying to put it down, her lips slightly parted like she wanted to deny it but didn't know where to begin. Doug, however, stayed frozen in place for a beat, then shook his head like a kid being told Santa wasn't real. No, he muttered. Dad said I could have it. He told me. I'm sure he did, I said, cutting him off. He told you a lot of things. But what he told the lawyer was something else entirely. That was after our little conversation. I didn't need to say more. They all remembered the timeline. They all knew I'd come up alone 2 months before Dad's health started slipping, and now they were finally realizing that conversation hadn't been small talk and nostalgia. Doug stood abruptly, knocking his chair back so hard it scraped the hardwood. His voice cracked when he spoke, which only made it worse. You only got that because Dad felt guilty, he shouted, pointing a trembling finger at me. After what you did to him. And, just like that, the room turned. Eyes snapped to me, Janice's wide with panic, Ron's narrowed with something close to shame, and Kelly's darting between us like she'd just realized this wasn't a holiday gathering anymore. It was a war tribunal, and she hadn't picked a side. I didn't move. Didn't blink. Just held my ground and let the words hang there in the air like smoke from a burning photograph. After what I did to him, I repeated softly, not as a question, but as a statement of disbelief, of fury barely held back. I stared at my brother then, this man who once lived on my couch, who had borrowed money he never paid back, who had called me selfish for not attending his birthday party the same year I was in the hospital recovering from exhaustion. And I wondered how many people like him believed the stories they told about people like me. Because the biggest lie at that table wasn't who owned the cabin. It was the idea that I had done something wrong by asking for what I deserved. The real question, the one no one dared ask, was what exactly Doug meant by what I did to him. And why, after all these years, that guilt had been strong enough for Dad to give me everything he never said out loud. The first time I truly saw my father as a flawed man and not the quiet, dependable figure I'd always assumed he was, I was 16 years old and on my way to the kitchen for a glass of water sometime around midnight. It was one of those rare summer nights when the heat made everything feel heavier than it should, when even the floorboards creaked like they were tired of being walked on. I remember padding quietly down the hall barefoot, the air sticky on my skin, when I heard his voice from the den, low, hushed, too soft for how he normally talked, and definitely not the way he spoke to Mom. He was on the phone, turned slightly away from the door, his hand covering his mouth like he thought the furniture might overhear him. I froze, not out of some noble respect for his privacy, but because of the tone. It was the kind of voice you use when you're saying something you don't want the world to hear. The words themselves weren't clear, not entirely, but I caught pieces. Little fragments that stuck like glass splinters in my memory. I know, he whispered, pacing lightly, but it's complicated with Janice. She's not like before. Then a name. Karen. Karen H. That stuck with me most. He said it like it meant something more than just a casual contact. Something tender. Something fragile. Something dangerous. I didn't say anything then. I didn't ask him about it later. I didn't tell Janice, and I sure as hell didn't tell Doug. But after that night, something shifted in me. I started seeing the cracks in the plaster, the way Dad sometimes looked at the door too long after coming home, the way he flinched when the phone rang and it was an unknown number. I pulled away from him slowly, the way you let go of a memory that no longer feels safe to hold. Years passed. college, work, the whole ugly crawl toward adulthood. I built a life outside that house, one spreadsheet and insomnia-ridden night at a time. And I never asked questions, not even when I should have, because some parts of a family are held together by mutual silence, and I didn't want to be the one to set fire to it. But a few years ago, around the time Dad started forgetting words and asking about the same things twice in one conversation, I decided to get my finances in order. That meant combing through their accounts too, since I was helping pay the bills and balancing Mom's ridiculous habit of forgetting to mail things until 3 weeks late. That's when I saw it, a regular outgoing payment, same amount every month, sent to a woman named Karen H., tucked discreetly under a vague transaction label that could have passed for a utility company if I hadn't been paying attention. I remember staring at the statement like it had insulted me, and maybe it had. It told me that the conversation I'd overheard all those years ago hadn't been a one-time lapse in judgment. It had been a second life. A ghost relationship kept just far enough from the surface to avoid detection, but close enough to fund every month like a secret hobby. So I did what any daughter with access to an old man's paperwork would do. I dug. Not obsessively. Not all at once. Just slowly, meticulously, the way you peel back wallpaper to see what's really underneath. I found more payments, going back farther than I expected. I found a card, unsigned but in Dad's handwriting, stashed behind an old book in the study, addressed to Karen but never mailed. And I found, most painfully, a Christmas ornament in the attic scratched faintly with her name on the bottom, hidden among the decorations we hadn't touched in years. Like he wanted her to be part of the holidays, in the tiniest, most pitiful way. 2 months before his stroke, I came home under the pretense of helping around the house. Janice was out visiting her sister, Doug was God knows where, and Dad and I sat on the porch one evening with a silence between us thick as tar. I waited until he was halfway through his second whiskey before I asked, "Who's Karen?" He didn't pretend. Didn't flinch. He just stared out at the dead grass and sighed like something had finally caught up to him. "That was a long time ago," he said quietly. "She doesn't matter anymore." "Doesn't matter, or doesn't exist?" I asked, and he closed his eyes. "She needed help," he said after a long pause. I couldn't walk away. I tried, but it was never about leaving your mother. It was just different. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just told him, "You need to update your will." He turned to look at me then, eyes glassy, not from drink, but from the kind of shame that sits in a man's bones. "I already did," he said. "I made it right. You deserve something. After everything." I nodded. Then I told him I wouldn't say a word. And I didn't. Until now. Back at the dinner table, after Doug's outburst about Dad feeling guilty, a low murmur passed between bites and shifting chairs. Then Janice looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite name, part pain, part understanding, and just a touch of something like surrender. She leaned in, eyes not leaving mine, and whispered under her breath so soft it barely carried over the clink of silverware. "So you knew about Karen?" I smiled, not with cruelty but with certainty. "I knew a lot more than any of you ever thought." And that was the moment the meal ended. Not physically, the food remained, half-eaten and cold, but emotionally, the table collapsed. Because now they all knew I wasn't just angry or bitter or ambitious. I was informed. And nothing is more terrifying at a family gathering than the one person who remembers everything. It was always going to come down to this, me standing, wine glass in hand, surrounded by the ruins of polite conversation and family civility, pretending we were still just another normal American family sitting around a table filled with lukewarm food and buried landmines. The turkey had long since cooled, and the mashed potatoes were starting to harden around the edges like concrete setting in a cold basement, but no one was eating anymore. Not really. People pushed food around on their plates, stabbing green beans with mechanical apathy, the kind of dazed detachment you see in folks who just survived a car crash but haven't noticed the blood yet. Doug was still standing, arms crossed now, like he was trying to fold himself into a shape small enough to hide the shame of his last outburst. Janice had gone ghost pale, her hand clutching the stem of her wine glass like it was a lifeline, eyes red, but not quite crying. Ron hadn't spoken a word since I'd mentioned Karen, his jaw clenched so tight I could almost hear his molars grinding from across the table. The air was thick and stagnant, with everything that had finally been dragged out of the shadows and into the light. I stood slowly, like I was in no rush at all, and raised my glass in a casual, almost lazy arc, the way you do when you're offering a toast that isn't really a toast, but a statement dressed up in tradition. I just wanted to say, I began, my voice calm but carrying, how thankful I am to be here this year. Really, I mean that. It's been illuminating. Doug scoffed, but I kept going before he could open his mouth again. I'm thankful for truth, I said, glancing briefly at Ron, who looked away like he'd suddenly developed an interest in the salt shaker. For memory. For finally realizing that silence doesn't mean peace, and family doesn't always mean loyalty. Janice's breath hitched, but still no one interrupted. They were waiting now. They knew something else was coming. They just didn't know what. I've spent most of my life trying to earn a seat at this table, I said, walking slowly around the edge of the dining room, letting my fingers graze the back of each chair as I passed. Working harder than anyone else here. Paying bills that weren't mine. Fixing problems I didn't cause. Pretending like I didn't notice when certain names disappeared from conversations. Or when my own was scratched out of documents like I'd never been there to begin with. Kelly tried to catch my eye from the far end of the table, but I looked past her. She didn't matter anymore. None of them did. I sold the cabin, I said, dropping it like a brick into a still pond. 2 weeks ago. Closed on it last Friday. Got a good price, too. The market's strong up there for second homes. Especially ones with a dock and no emotional baggage. Doug's chair screeched against the floor as he stood again, his face flushed with fury and disbelief. You can't. You didn't have the right. I had the deed, I said plainly. That's all the right I needed. Janice finally broke. But your father promised. No, I said, my voice sharp now, slicing clean through the room. He promised Doug. Over whiskey and guilt. But he signed the papers sober. That's what counts. Ron didn't say a word. He just sat there, eyes dull, looking every bit like a man who'd gambled with other people's lives and was only just realizing the house always wins. I'm leaving, I said, and I meant it in more ways than one. Not just the house. The country. I'm moving to Lisbon next month. I got an offer to consult with a company there, triple what I make now. And more importantly, I don't have to be anyone's daughter or sister over there. Just Elena. Janice was crying now, quietly, the kind of broken sob that comes from realizing you've run out of people to control. Doug looked ready to throw something, but for once he had nothing in his hands to hurl, and even less in his head to offer in return. You wanted me to be part of this family, I said, turning back toward the table. Well, now you get to feel what it's like when I'm gone. No more safety nets. No more blank checks. No more cleaning up the messes you won't even admit are yours. I drained the last of my wine in one long, satisfying sip, walked to the door, and paused just long enough to scratch behind the ears of the old Labrador curled up by the coat rack, the only soul in the house who ever loved me without condition. I said goodbye to him softly, then opened the door and stepped out into the cool evening air, letting it hit me like absolution. Out in the car, the engine still cold beneath my hands, I pulled out my phone and stared at the screen for a moment. I hadn't planned to make the call tonight, but something about the finality of walking away made it feel necessary, like sealing a letter before you send it into the fire. I tapped the number I'd saved weeks ago, after months of quiet digging and private doubt. It rang once, then twice, then a voice, young, tentative, unsure. Hello. I smiled, the first real one of the evening. Hi, I said softly. It's your Aunt Elena. I know we've never met, but I wanted to talk. And just like that, everything shifted again. because maybe I hadn't come back just for revenge. Maybe I'd come to make something new out of the wreckage. Or maybe I'd just gotten tired of being the family's ghost. Either way, the story wasn't over. Not yet.